Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. It is Thursday, January 22nd, a day later than we usually record, but it may have been an important day with some developments we've had over the last 36 hours. And as you can imagine, the whatever is going on Greenland is high on our list. And we had these speeches at Davos, kind of I thought we were post Davos. Davos, for some reason, is kind of a thing again, right? To the extent there is such a thing as neoliberalism and sort of global elite cosmopolitan culture, that is it. But it is sort of back in a way. In any case, there were speeches by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. Very interesting figure, sort of a wouldn't say an accidental prime minister, but as we know, someone who became, the liberals had been in power for a dozen years, and they were going to get swept out, and the conservatives were going to take over. The Conservative Party had the misfortune of having a very Trumpy uh, standard bearer, and the liberals were able to have Justin Trudeau step down, go to Mark Carney. It's a very interesting figure. He is certainly the only prime minister ever in world history who has not only run a central bank, he's run two central banks. Like, who has run two central banks in two different countries? It's like being president of two different countries. A very interesting figure. And so, what sort of bringing all that stuff together, I feel like we're in kind of different territory over the last few days. It's very hard to say, like, wow, Donald Trump has gotten crazier. Like he's gone further than he's ever gone before. Um, but he gave this speech at Davos that would be pretty unhinged at one of his rallies, right? I mean, just I feel like it is at a new level. And Carney, and I really, if you have a moment, look up this speech. It's a very interesting speech, and heads of government and heads of speeches are generally not that interesting. And he basically said something he's been saying here and there for, in some ways, since he became prime minister, that we are not in a the globe is not in a period of transition. We are in a period of disruption, a major rupture, where the post World War, kind of rule based system is ending. And everybody has been saying this for a while, but he said it, I think, in a kind of newly convincing way, and actually, kind of suggesting a way forward, and a way that countries like Canada, and maybe, particularly Canada, might play a leading role in. And it was very interesting because, one of the crazinesses of Trumpism is that they are in revolt against a world order that we built, that has been extraordinarily successful over 80 years, has brought a great deal of stability and prosperity, and to a great degree liberalization and democratization to a lot of the world. And yet it has always been inflected towards us. We are at the center of it. It gives us unique advantages. And as Carney explained in this speech, that it was never a purely rules-based order. the US got to operate by somewhat different rules than other countries. But it was such a good deal overall that a lot of countries worked with it and benefited from it. And he is saying that is now over. So maybe we should build a global rules based order that is actually a rules based order that is not underwritten by one superpower or unipower or whatever. So anyway, these are all the things we are going to talk about. I do, I have said a number of times over the last few weeks that Donald Trump, we are on the ride with Donald Trump on this very strange sort of psychological decompensation, which is that as he loses popularity at home, as he loses power at home, he's leaning into these violent prerogative powers more and more. And we are seeing that. And that's what that speech is about. This is playing out. So, Kay, let's start with let's start with Greenland and the speech. What do you make of this entire thing where we are?
I think Carney's speech was so remarkable because it, even now, even when it's pretty clear that the order of the past 80 years is, I mean, it's past recovery, right? Like Trump round one, the feeling from, our allies and Europe especially was kind of appease him, work around him, wait till he's gone. This was an aberration. We just kind of have to ride it out. Um, and then things go back to normal. And, if there's one thing that 2024 just said decisively, it wasn't an aberration, right? This is who America is. Um, if it wasn't, he wouldn't have been elected again. He would have been removed from office, which leads you to the conclusion that, there's too big a part of the country that precludes those things from happening. So that means that is what America is. And, this is like the oldest kind of little one liner, but it's like Europe can't keep crossing its fingers that, 40,000 people in Wisconsin are not pissy about the price of eggs any given year. And so I think Carney was just still a lot of, Europeans are trying to do the appeasement thing. They're trying to like kiss his ass, trying to just keep their heads down until things return to normal. And I think he was the first one who was brave enough to say, this is the new normal. The past 80 years is over. And it's hard to process that because, as you said in the intro, that regime of stability was so beneficial to the United States, like as much as it was to, smaller countries who by and large didn't have to worry about getting run roughshod over anymore. It's the same dynamic that having the dollar be the dominant currency redounds to the United States benefits in all these ways. Having kind of trust and alliances and people thinking that more or less you're going to kind of go by norms and not be, you know, in general rapacious and greedy, that all of these things served the US so well. And Trump has never understood that, right? In the first term it was all this trade imbalance stuff and now it's this tariff stuff. He's not smart enough to see how this positioning, in even though the United States might be giving up some old kind of superpower benefits in terms of, stomping in wherever they want and kind of taking what they want and being rapacious, you're getting so much in return. And it's such an unprecedented, again, generally an unprecedented time of peace versus when you're doing the kind of spheres of influence stuff. There are constant wars, there's constant battling and like redrawing of the lines and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's hard to let it sink in because it's so unusual to watch a superpower take a
Fold.
gun, load the
Yeah.
bullets, and shoot itself in the face like this. But he's right. I mean, this is what is going to happen now. European countries and, maybe Australia and maybe Japan are going to they're going to have to arm themselves probably with nukes. I mean, what else can you do? And at least he's proposing a path forward, this kind of like, the middle countries, the middle tier countries bonding together to form their own kind of sphere of influence, or else get trampled all over by either, the United States or China or, theoretically Russia. So eh, I don't know. It's been hard to stomach these past few days. And I've been reading a lot of, people who know a lot more than I do about foreign affairs. And it's been a little bit crushing, I think, to kind of read these things and realize that we have kind of voluntarily ended, the Pax Romana in exchange for a much scarier future, and that the vast majority of people in this country are not aware of this. Maybe will never be aware of this, will never put these pieces together, aren't interested enough to see how their decision making, has put us down this road. It all feels so kind of, you know, pointless, brutal, violent, frightening.
Yeah, yeah. It is a sort of, an act of self destruction that is hard to understand, and it is all, for a long time we've known we were going in this direction for a long time, and we had a chance to sort of shift gears with the Biden presidency. For various reasons that did not work out as many of us hoped. And even to your point, like, there's 2024, there's also 2025, because you can't, one of the things that always stood out to me about Donald Trump's first presidency, certainly for the first 3.5 years or so, is that he's out saying a lot of crazy stuff, and he's doing a fair amount of crazy stuff. But most of the crazy stuff is stuff that, if you are not plugged into news, if you don't kind of live this stuff that we do, there's a lot of stuff that is like warnings about all the bad things. There's a lot of red flags, there's a lot of bad signs. But if you are apolitical, y- you know that he is saying a bunch of crazy stuff, but like your life is going on like normal, right? And there's a lot of stuff. I mean, to a certain, for some people, that's still the case. But there is a lot more stuff that has happened in 2025, right? And any one person can do any crazy thing, but you have systems in place to you have circuit breakers in a Republican system of government. And it's not just that he was elected in 2024. We're now into 2026, and 2025 gave no significant pause to the American Congress or the federal judiciary that anything's really amiss. You can imagine an alternative universe where he comes back into power. He's saying a bunch of crazy stuff about mass deportation, and he's going to bring down inflation. And we get into spring, and the U.S. Congress and the courts are like, dude, you can't, fuck this. You can't do this. You're out. We're gonna remove you from office. You know, we have, we in the United States can say, look, a majority is against this, and this is true. Now a significant majority is against this. But as long as 40% is okay with it, that's all that really matters. And we can have all of our internal stuff in the United States. But for other countries, they're going to say rightly, like, hey, tell yourself what you need to. But like, our focus is who controls the American military and who controls the tariffs. And like, we know a lot of you guys aren't crazy about this, but we're looking at you as a system. And your system is really dangerous to us. And like, we wish you the best, you good people, you people who aren't crazy about Donald Trump. But like, we don't care. It's just not relevant to us. And they're right. And this is, in various posts and maybe in the podcast before, I have, we in the U.S. political system, we tend to focus on the stuff that's happening domestically because we live here, right? And that's what we experience. I've always been more worried about the international stuff. Not because and you can say, and it may be right, that's because I am personally, at least at this point in my life, fairly insulated from a lot of the domestic stuff. But the thing with the international stuff is you can't turn it back. It may be hard to turn the stuff in the country back, but the country can make a decision to do that, right? If like if if in 2026 and 2028 a big majority of the country says we totally went off track, we're going to unwind all of this stuff. We can do that. You can't do that abroad. You change the system. You can't just change it back. It's bigger than you. Even a superpower can, sail on the global ocean. It doesn't run the global ocean. So a lot of this stuff is that's done. And the thing to say to Canada is, and I mean, I applaud that speech. The US isn't going anywhere. The US still has, far and away the biggest, most sophisticated military. We are, fabulously wealthy, so they can band together, but we're not going anywhere. And so there's a lot of chaos to come. And for those of us in the U.S. who are thinking like we are going to unwind this, and I have a lot of optimism about that. But if we unwind it, we are going to have to live in a different world where a lot of people don't like us, and most people don't trust us. And that is going to be a different world that we are living in. Kate, okay, so let's get this down to some specifics. This Greenland thing has, accelerated. And now yesterday, supposedly, at least if you go by Truth Social and Donald Trump's account, there's now this kind of working agreement or working group that is going to, as I understand it, under NATO auspices, uh, give the U.S. a bunch of new bases in Greenland, give the U.S. sovereignty over those bases, so they kind of become little parts of the U.S. permanent, and maybe some mineral rights near the bases, which what like that makes no sense. But like, how is NATO doing this? NATO, this isn't like I don't even know what's going on. What do you make of that whole thing?
Like, fine. I don't know. It's like it is this thing where people will just kind of like jangle the keys in front of Trump and he kind of gets distracted and that's what this seems to be. And we've seen things like this before where he makes insane demands. I mean, this was the whole beginning of the term, right? Like countries would just re-announce trade deals we already had with them and just say Trump did this and then he would say I
Move
made a new
along. Yeah.
deal. It's amazing. Look how great I am and would kind of like move to the next thing. I think and I did some reading about how kind of like Europeans reacted to the climb down and the general sentiment is like okay, but how long is this going to last, right? Which I think Trump's speech, which my god, basically everything he said in there is, the same rapacious, I want it, I need it, I'm going to have it kind of stuff. So
And also
I don't
wind
take a lot.
turbines don't work and birds, like also just the
Yeah,
all the
the
absurd
old
stuff.
hits,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah.
I know he had a whole section in there about how like the Chinese people don't actually use their wind farms. They just build them and take pictures of them and it's like 40% of electricity from wind comes from it's insane. But yeah, so I don't know that I would take a lot of comfort in that. Also, he kind of responded to Carney's speech where he said, there would be no Canada without the United States. Remember that before you make your statements, which is kind of mob bossy touch. But yeah, look, I mean, if if the NATO, you know, secretary general, whatever, can show Trump some PowerPoint that like convinces him that he owns Greenland enough to satisfy him now, like
Mhm.
terrific, great. Um I guess I don't feel that confident that this is the end of it because this has just been such a strange fixation of his for so long now, that in terms of how we can often count on his ephemeral attention span, this is a fixation that his I mean, we're going on a decade where he's really, really cared about this.
Right, and he does get distracted, but it comes back. So, like, yes, he may get I this is I still don't have a clear sense of what is going on in Venezuela. What, I guess there has been one of these oil sales, so some of this stuff that, like, we have this basic thing, like, okay, we came in, we grabbed the president, we have him, we did that, and then we said, now we run the country, and the people there were like, "Well, not really, like, we're still here, so, like, if you invade, maybe you c," so it didn't make sense, but some of those things that didn't make sense, they seem to be happening, so it's it's a little hard to make sense of what's real here and what's not real, and with this, Greenland thing, um, I'm sure maybe some of the powers involved would kind of sort of breathe a sigh of relief if we get these enclaves in Greenland that are military bases that are sovereign. Like, I guess. I mean, frankly, that's not great. I don't like the U.S. always could have had more bases in Greenland. Denmark is our NATO ally. If we had some reason that, look, we think this is going to be we need to keep these other powers out, it's not like there was some disagreement there. We could have them. So and there is this clearly this dynamic here, and we're seeing this more and more, where he is making these crazy demands, and not just illegitimate demands, but making them in this kind of bombastic, crazy way, and people are rushing up and saying, "Babadoo, babadoo, yes," and everything seems to be fake. Like, I saw, like, they're asking the governor of Denmark, and they're like, "Yeah, we have nothing to say. We have no idea what this is about." And so, like, to the extent that the NATO Secretary General can just sort of come up with some phantom process and everything, and Trump is satisfied, great. Given where we are, that's probably a good outcome. But, like, it it does show us again that we are in this bizarre moment where things get said and you have no idea what's real, and not even like, in in the Soviet Union, maybe you don't know what's real, but this is don't know what's real in kind of a, I don't know, a different sense. Like, it's one thing if, like, the people who run things say something and it's not real, but, like, the NATO guy, we're kind of dipping deeper into this moment of absurdity on the international stage, because everybody is seeing that the U.S. for the moment is controlled by a crazy man and could be controlled by some other crazy man in the future at any given point. And yes, Mark Carney is saying, okay, we need this new middle powers order, but you don't have it yet. For right now, we have the weapons and we have the money, and, like, people are saying, okay, let's tell him whatever you need to tell him. And that is a weird world to be living in.
I do wonder if we're going to see other US bases, which are all over Europe, start becoming a point of contention if European countries are going to shut those down. I mean, it's almost sad because it's kind of a statement of how peaceful things were before, that it was pretty normal to have these US bases just like in European countries, and it was fine and harmonious and not like a scary thing, to have a
Mhm,
foreign
mhm.
power kind of, right in your space. Um, but yeah, I think it's felt so different recently because we're moving at such a fast clip again. His focus is more on the international stage than it has been before as he kind of becomes obsessed with like legacy and mortal legacy. He's talking about God and heaven like all the time. Um and meanwhile, this is editor John Light's kind of uh framing, which I think is really good, that this term is the inverse of the first term, in that the first time, Trump was surrounded by like fairly sober people who, famously curtailed his worst instincts and stopped him from doing some of the horrible things. And that this term is that the exact inverse, where Trump is weaker, less energetic, less focused, and he's surrounded by people who are kind of taking advantage of his pliability to advance their own ends. And it's just a good formulation for explaining some of the weirdnesses, right? Because, you're like, well, why Venezuela? What's that about? And then you're like, well, this is a Rubio thing. He wants to do Venezuela. He wants to do Cuba. Trump, doesn't object by any means, but he's kind of doing his thing, and Miller wants to deport Venezuela. And so that's how you kind of explain that. And, you know, he's more just this channel for other people's desires. And so even while he's, melting on stage and seeming just unwell in all these ways, we didn't talk about, he sent a letter to the leader of Norway saying the Greenland thing is about not getting the Peace Prize. It's just so pathetic. And what's so scary though is now he has this like bastion of people around him who are not, you know, declining physically, mentally, whatever, and have just access to like the unfettered power of the United States and can turn that to their own ends. So, it's also a little bit, I think, the jangling keys method is not so reliable anymore, because you can maybe get Trump onto something else, but
But Stephen
the
Miller's not gonna
psychos
get
in the
distracted. Yeah.
exactly, the psychos in the upper echelon are going to keep pushing whatever their kind of like pet fascistic project is.
There's also, there was a political piece, I think it was political piece, 3 or 4 days ago, that basically said, the White House is getting a little spooked that the ICE stuff is, that they're losing the public on the ICE stuff, and they're worried about it, that it's a problem. And if you read the piece a little closely, it was clear that one group in the White House, probably centering around Susie Wiles and the relatively, to the extent that you have kind of a little slightly more old school people, maybe people who are really plugged into the 2026 election. And generally speaking, the chief of staff is always pretty, chief of staff is chief of staff, but they're always pretty focused on elections, because if you lose the election, you can't do the stuff that the chief of staff is supposed to be, the making the trains go to the right places and all this kind of stuff. And so that is it was very interesting, because like a week or two ago we had this thing of like, they're saying it's great for them politically to say like, yeah, she should have been shot, she was begging to be shot because she's a terrorist and stuff. And I think a lot of us, at least, you know all the people who see those videos and think like, this is he just like killed this woman in cold blood, right? It's just like murder. um we're thinking like, I don't think people see that. And so, but clearly in the White House, there are a lot of people who are worried about the political fallout of this, but they are clearly not the people really in the saddle. And you have something in that, you have analogous stuff, as you said, Rubio in Venezuela, and whatever is driving the Greenland thing, and the stuff with the Nobel Prize. Uh, again, I still do think we are in this period of this guy is decompensating, not necessarily because of any sort of physical or cognitive deterioration. I think he is decompensating because he's losing. Um, but he can do a lot while he's losing. And again, that's why we're talking about stuff abroad, because the president is basically a dictator abroad, more or less, especially if the Supreme Court lets him do tariffs at will. Um, so yeah, it's a tough time.
So we'll use that to segue to another Supreme Court case this week, one of the biggest of the term, which centered on Trump's firing of a Federal Reserve governor, which, on the one hand is kind of just a natural extension of his and Elon Musk's rampage through the federal government. We've seen another of the big independent agency cases already reach the Supreme Court. They seem poised to overturn Humphrey's executor, the precedent that protects these independent agency boards from at will firing from the president. But throughout, the big question has been: will the Supreme Court reverse engineer some way, despite the growing power of the unitary executive, to protect the Fed? Because everybody knows that having the central bank not be independent, be under the president's whim, would be, economically disastrous, because every president, and particularly this one, would have so much incentive to try to play around with the economy to produce kind of good short-term conditions, no matter what the long-term ramifications are. So that oral argument happened yesterday, and the real resounding conclusion was even the conservatives are, well, not Thomas, but even the conservatives who can be won are pretty squeamish about this. The biggest moment was when Brett Kavanaugh just said cut and dry to John Sauer, the Solicitor General, that their theory of for cause removal would weaken, if not shatter, the independence of the Federal Reserve. So it seems pretty likely that we're going to get some kind of concocted reason why the Fed is special, why the Fed is different. It'll be totally incoherent, in accordance with the rest of their jurisprudence around this topic. But, the question is kind of how narrow or how broad are they going to make that ruling? How staunch will it be, going forward, especially as Trump has by this point expended an awful lot of energy and now prosecutorial might at, bringing the Fed under his heel.
Yeah, I mean, the on the one hand, we get sort of a good result because demographically and ideologically, the people who, the Federal Society people, they want an independent Federal Reserve. Generally speaking, established wealth wants independent. That's not the only reason, but they don't want to mess with the Fed. But we are also seeing a paradoxically maybe the greatest example of their corruption, frankly, because when obviously you ask all sorts of questions in oral arguments, and a justice is not tied to, oh, you asked this question and the reasoning that is implicit in it, that's wrong, so you're bad, and all this kind of stuff. Having said that, um, just because that might shatter the independence of the Federal Reserve, so what? The question is whether the Constitution prevents Congress from creating agencies that the president doesn't have absolute sway over. And that is either the case or it's not the case. And if Congress can't do that, these result-based reasonings that you don't like, that doesn't matter. So it kind of like in a way will probably get a good result that they won't kind of wash this out with everything else. But it just shows that really they kind of don't like um, regulatory agencies, and they want to get rid of them. And that's you know that's where we have a dictatorial, corrupt Supreme Court, and will perversely maybe benefit a little, but it doesn't make them any less corrupt.
And just on the economic piece in general, I have to admit it's been one of like the weirdest parts of Trump 2 to me so far, that the markets just don't really react to stuff, or don't react as dramatically as you'd expect them to. And I think a big, a leading explanation for this so far has been the taco effect, right? That people just kind of don't believe that Trump will follow through with stuff, and that his unpredictability is somewhat kind of baked in at this point.
Right.
But especially what he's doing on the international stage right now, if the dollar loses its place of prominence, if US bond markets start to go into turmoil, if there's an auction where no one bids, I mean, those would be kind of catastrophic and seem almost certain if he continues this way, and alienates all of our allies, and we become just kind of strategic competitors with these countries rather than friends and neighbors, and
Hmm.
helping each other. I admit I really don't quite understand what the delay seems to be in people who generally, have a vested interest in kind of looking a few steps ahead and just kind of
Hmm.
going about business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think one of the answers is that, like, I remember back in the '90s or the early aughts, having someone explain to me, like, I kind of got onto the fact that, like, China owns a significant portion of the U.S. debt, and that has only increased in the last 15 to 20 years. And I was talking to someone in international economics, like, isn't this like a pretty big leverage they have over us in any sort of in in any sort of conflict we might get in with them? And what this person pointed out to me is like, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to sell those however many $1 trillion of U.S. debt assets on fire sale terms? And like, it's so much money. What are they going to buy? Right? Like, and who's going to buy them? So like, to a certain extent, obviously this is a couple decades later, but to a certain extent, these things are the whole international system. Well, to a great degree, the international system is based on the transaction of U.S. debt as in effect a kind of, I'm mixing the, obviously this isn't the technical term, but almost like a quasi currency on a global basis. You can't just stop doing that on a dime. Um, and I think we saw, in the spring when, these tariff things were, all that stuff was coming down. And there was a period where the bond yield started to flutter a little, people getting a little spooked. And that was when clearly Trump pulled some of, and started doing like, oh, we're going to delay for 8 weeks and all this kind of stuff. And that kind of settled things down. I don't, I'm not a, I don't, that's out of my world. I don't know enough to predict. I suspect, you don't see sort of like, car driving into the ditch, sort of dramatic things. These things take a while to shake out. Um, but yeah, yeah, I would say with the market in general, some of that at least is, the huge sway of a relatively small number of billionaires. And that on the one hand, some of their spending and predictive decisions become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? You also have a bigger role for retail investors than there used to be. It used to be the big institutional investors, the very wealthy people, the family offices and stuff. They really made the markets do what it did. And the retail investors were these people without a lot of information getting kind of crushed at the margins. But that's changed somewhat, and you have them running things. So the whole all of the market stuff is not something I have any real expertise on. But yeah, we seem to be accelerating the dismantlement both on the economic side and the security side of what underwrites everything. Um, and there's just, as you say, there's very little. Most people don't have a sense of like what the effects of this are, but we are going into it one way or another. Do you, before we go off on that, is there, what can we tell readers about our best current understanding of is there some reality to this Greenland framework, or does this seem to be just for a moment talk, or we just have no idea?
No idea. Yeah, there've just been like no details coming out about it. And I feel like, the NATO side is walking on eggshells, right? Like trying not maybe being light on details on purpose because you don't want to like accidentally set off a landmine. So
Right, right,
yeah,
right.
we'll see.
Well, as long as, and I suppose that, like, as long as he is momentarily mollified, Denmark doesn't want to stand up and say, "This is bullshit, dude. We're
Right.
not doing that." So, yeah, who knows? Okay, next.
Um yeah, we just wanted to end with this little microcosm example of how appeasing Trump just really never works. And it's it's all contained in this little world where Bill Cassidy, who is the senator from Louisiana, who is a medical doctor, he is running for reelection in 2026. At least he still says he is. And over this past weekend, Trump preemptively endorsed Julia Letlow, a member of the House who had not formally announced that she was going to run for Senate yet. And then she did formally announce, a couple days after that. And her little tagline with her announcement video was, Louisiana deserves a senator who will not waver. Thank you for your endorsement and your trust, President Trump. So the waiver in question here is Cassidy, and the wavering in question is he's one of the 7 Republican senators who voted to impeach Trump. There are only 3 of them left. It's him, Collins, and Murkowski. And then he, in a moment where he had immense political power, could have killed the confirmation of RFK and chose not to. But even that brief moment of equivocation, where a medical doctor had the power to stop the confirmation of an avowed anti vaxxer whose elevation has already resulted in the death of children of preventable disease, um, that wavering, what did he get for ending his term with the most disgusting breach of your Hippocratic oath you could ask for, with the blood of children on your hands for his pain? He got likely a career ending primary challenge from the right, who, in kind of a twist of irony, Letlow got the seat because her husband, who had won the election, died of COVID before he was sworn in,
Oh,
and then
I
she
forgot
won the
about that.
special
I forgot
election.
about that. I forgot about that.
Yeah, so there is like just the little irony there of like she is implicitly promising not to add any friction to RFK's regime, right? After she suffered this kind of loss. But it's, I have to say, it's like we've reached the point where cowardly Republican senators should not affect me in any way because it's so, this is the world we're living in, right? It's like Tom Tillis, who is not running next year, will not even criticize Trump directly. He'll still do the, oh, the president's getting bad advice thing. Like these people are so unbelievably cowardly that it shouldn't be surprising. But it is just, I admit, I'm still just astonished by, I guess, the power lust that it requires to be a doctor and make a decision like that and not even reap any political reward. I think the political reward he would have reaped would have been unbelievably insufficient, but still, it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
even a politically smart move, on top of being just morally completely repugnant.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm on the right track here, but my sense at least, I mean, there is a sort of profile of medical doctors who get into politics, and often, they practice for a while, made some money, and then they get into politics, and at least from my perspective, often those people, you get very little sense that sort of the what we want to have in the ethical posture of doctors is not really informing their worldview. That was just a job they had, and now they're on to politics. And to the extent it was a job they had, it was one where you get to belong to the country club and make a lot of money and all that kind of stuff. My sense, at least, is that Cassidy actually has some real motivation about public health and helping people not die for preventable reasons, right? I mean, this is, he's been there for a while, and it's not even a matter of praising him because he did what he did, but yeah, and the other thing, look, another, I mean, this is sort of feels like ancient history now, but Joni Ernst really sort of seemed like she was stopping Pete Hegseth's nomination in its tracks. She's a veteran. I don't remember the precise details, but had some, in the military sexual assault experience, and that was a very big issue for her. And she was like, she was shutting it down, and then, you know, Trump made clear that wasn't acceptable, and she fell into line. And now she's also not running. And it was, people have different theories of this, but I think it's the same thing. Like, coming into line, like if they have to tell you, sit you down and say, this one isn't optional, you have to do this, that you've already gone too far. If they have to have that conversation, you need to stand up and just say, whoever Donald Trump nominated, I am 100% behind them, because it is the same thing. And it's, they in a way, it is sort of a distant parallel of like stochastic terrorism, because I'm not even sure, well, here Donald Trump, did the endorsement, but with Ernst, it was clear that MAGA just was not into her anymore afterwards. So he doesn't even need to do the endorsement. She just kind of knew that, like, it wasn't worth it anymore. So yeah, and my sense is, Murkowski and Collins, these people from purplish, Alaska's a funny state, but it has some purplish dimensions. But he's from Louisiana. Like, good luck. I don't know what the polls say, but I would, as you say, I mean, I think it's possible we may hear in a couple of weeks that he's retiring.
I think the thing that, like, kills me so much, whether it be Cassidy with RFK or Ernst with Hegseth or, Collins with Brett Kavanaugh, is that their choices here weren't these spectacularly flawed nominees or AOC, right? Like, the choice was Brett Kavanaugh or another Federalist test tube baby who hasn't been accused of sexual assault, right?
Or
Like,
hasn't been accused as much.
yeah. No, or yeah, exactly. Or maybe, like, the woman doesn't wanna come forward or something. It's just like they're you're being asked so little, and all of these people are already they have wealth, they have status. If they're no longer in the Senate, they are going to be living better than most people in this country, and yet, when they have, even for just a small ephemeral window of time, power to change the trajectory of the country, they balk. It's so pathetic to me. I mean, it's just these jobs are cushy and they come with a lot of perks, but they're not easy to get. And I find it really kind of baffling that if you wanna do so little, like, if you wanna be a backbencher and just kind of enjoy the trappings and, get to go to Mar-a-Lago for stuff and the White House Christmas party, like, just sit on your dad's board and donate a lot of money to Trump. It's, like, the same end result. I just don't understand why these people go into public service and choose to crumple under just the slightest degree of pressure. It's just so completely pathetic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other side of it, is, Trump runs the Republican Party, and he especially runs Republican primaries. So, like, do you want to be a senator or not? That's not a nothing threat. If you
But they barely wanna be a senator. They just wanna, like, go to stuff in a pack. I don't
Yeah,
I
no,
don't get
I
it.
believe me, I agree, but, like, but you do have that little parentheses "R" after your name
I
and the
guess.
SEN before it, you are a senator, right? You may not be in charge of what you vote for, but you are up there and you are, and look, this is, people, they get into politics, they're ambitious, they want that title, they want, think about Lindsey Graham. He is just sort of a performing clown for Donald Trump, but, within the bounds of what Donald Trump thinks is okay, he gets to go on the weekend shows and he says what we're going to do in Venezuela and all. I agree with you, but some people want those gigs, and we know, what is it, Bob Corker, the guy who, not, I guess you wouldn't say he's in trouble exactly with Olivia Nuzzi, but there's people who kind of would not go along with Trump, and they're gone. And
Mhm.
people have had to decide, like, do I want to still do this thing and go on the Codells and whatever. For a lot of people, that's still a cool job, and they've decided that they'll do whatever Trump wants, and that is where we are. I mean, I guess the other thing is we're talking about people here who, in each case, were on the more independent side, right? Or for whatever reason, Bill Cassidy's from a very red state, but he's got his, he look, he voted. I give him credit for what he did. He voted to remove Donald Trump from office. That's,
Yeah.
they had to know that could come back to bite them. Um, but, like, with most of I still see in liberal circles on Blue Sky and all these kind of things, when the House votes for something, like, where's the backbone? Where's the courage? Why do they have to do what Donald Trump tells them to do? Well, these are just people who were at the rally. They're not cowards. They like him. So let's identify it correctly, right? Bill Cassidy may be a coward because he knew what RFK Jr. was about. But most of these guys, they're not cowards. They're authoritarians and fascists. That's not being cowardly. They want this. I remember when, in the in Trump's first term, with Bill Barr. And people thought at first, Bill Barr's an institutionalist. He'll keep this guy in line, right? He's solid. He's conservative, but he's solid. And then he went everywhere with Trump. And I remember either someone saying this to me or having kind of an epiphany of, like, what made me think that a 70 something white conservative Catholic Fox News watching man would would be any different from every other guy in that demographic in the United States, right? And it applies to a lot of the people that serve in Congress right now. And to bring it back full circle, that's what they're thinking in the capitals of Europe right now. Maybe there's not a courage deficit. This is just what the U.S. is right now. That every election is a coin toss, whether we get these Donald Trump type people in power. Like you said, we're kind of we are at the mercy of a sort of a an angsty county in Wisconsin,
I mean,
and
and
that's not great.
they're right. Like we had inflection points where the Republican Party could have decided it wanted to be something else, and it didn't choose to do that. There are some people who bear more of the blame than others. Mitch McConnell after January 6th really, comes to mind. But I mean, I just see no future, no short term future where every election is not at least a 50-50% chance to have this ethos back in charge of the United States, and it's a big country and an unruly country. And I guess this is just what 40% of it is, thereabouts. And because of the way that, you know, our legislature is run and our elections are run, that's enough to win a lot of the time. So, yeah, I mean, as Carney said, nostalgia is not a strategy. This is what the Republican Party is now, and it doesn't show any signs of, you know, displeasure with the mutation. The ones who didn't like it have self-sorted out into the Democratic Party, they're
Right.
the Liz Cheneys now. So, I don't know. I think that's why these weeks have felt so different. It's just I think, you kind of have to, like, go through the stages of acceptance to realize, A, wasn't a fluke, B, this is who we are, C, this is who we're gonna be at least for some of the time for, the foreseeable future.
Well, and I think for those of us who are hoping for something different in the United States, the goal has to be in the immediate term to reclaim power and shift the furniture around in a big way, in a big structural way, so that the state is not as vulnerable to what we have seen in 2025 in the future. Now, at a certain level, you elect people to office and, they're going to do what they want, but not totally, right? There are things you can do when you have power to make that a lot harder. But, fundamentally, you are not going to in the short term, you're not going to change the fact that like as you say, 40% of the electorate wants this. And a decent amount of time, they are going to win elections, and that is just the world that we are living in at the moment. So yeah, well, I guess a kind of a sobering podcast this week, but that's where we are, and we will we will keep it real for you, regardless of what the news is presenting us going forward in the coming weeks. So, anything else for this week?
That's it. See you next time.
All right, later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.